Good afternoon to everybody. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. I apologize, but every now and then I have some problems with the computer. I hope you spent an eventful weekend and that you had enough time to rest and you're ready for this new series of lessons. Just let's see if I see any. Yes, Demofonti says good afternoon. Okay, that's fine. So what? Just let me see here. Review. Yes, okay, that's fine. What I wanted to do today and next days is go on in this analysis of comparing legal systems, looking at the issue of looking at the economic system. As I've already mentioned, the economy influences a lot the legal system, but at the same time, a legal system influences a lot the economy, and therefore, in this circular process, we have to try to understand and distinguish the various legal systems. Obviously, we're talking of Western legal systems, and look at the differences that exist. Now, before I forget, just please, as I haven't had time to take note of who's here, who isn't here, I see we are 54, that's great. Please just write your name on the chat so I just know who, and then I can just know who's here, who isn't here. It's just to know who is participating at the classes and who isn't, and so eventually I can send those who are not participating, just tell them, well, you can look up the lessons, you were absent, you can find them on a certain while I'll be sending you the slides. I trust you received, did you receive, did I send some slides? I hope, yes, I sent some slides. Did you receive them? Can someone answer? Yes, okay, that's good. Sorry. Now, what I'm going to do now is just let me go on the screen, is let me share the screen. Okay. Just to remember how the system, I'll just go back here. The Anglo-American model. So the fact that the Anglo-American model is based on on the fact that the company, when it needs its capital for its activity, for its investment, it goes, as I've said, goes public in the sense that it offers its shares on the stock market to receive money from those who want to buy the shares, and therefore the financial assets come from the public at large, not because they are publicly owned to the state, but simply because the public at large participates in this economic endeavor, and therefore the company issues shares. These shares are sold on the stock market. They are bought by individual investors and by investment institutions, and there the shareholders are rewarded with a dividend. Just a few more information on the Anglo-American model. Obviously, if as the main source of capital for a company comes from the stock market, and the stock market obviously is a financial marketplace, we have to be very careful in regulating the financial market. The 1929 crash, Wall Street crash, was the consequences of an unregulated financial market. The stock market substantially was not regulated. Also, the 2008 great financial crash, in which the Lehman Brothers, one of the biggest banks in the world, collapsed, was also due to the fact that they they were not sufficiently controlled, and this had some very devastating effects for the financial system, not only of the US, but of the rest of the world. So just to point out, when we have in the Anglo-American model, these two aspects are very much related. So we cannot look at company law when we study company law, which is a very important part of our curriculum, whatever the country, the jurisdiction we are studying it. We must also take in mind financial markets regulation. In a system where instead capitals have a different provenance, well, financial markets are important, but they are less important than in the US. Now, again, just to point out, to give you some elements, we have moved to the US because that is the place where real capitalism, whether we like it or not, obviously, we can have various ideas on the good and the evil of capitalism, but I mean the place where capitalism from a legal point of view is most developed is the US. But when we talk about the US, please remember that the US we have a federal state, and then we have a single 50 states, and these 50 states have jurisdiction in the field of company law. And therefore, there has been throughout the 2 centuries a very strong competition between American states in having somehow regulating company law. And contrary to what we might think, New York is the center of business of the U.S. business. Well, it's not the state of New York that substantially is the leader in company law. In America, they're called corporations, and this gives us an idea. All those of you who have studied Latin, you understand very well the notion of corpus corpora. I mean, there's an entity, there's a legal, it becomes a body, and so the law transforms what is totally abstract, the entity, which is a company, it turns it into a legal entity, which has, as if it was made of bones and flesh. So we have this tiny U.S. state, Delaware, which is south of New York State, which introduced in 1899 this Delaware General Corporations Law. And if we look at where most American corporations are incorporated, we see that 50% of publicly traded corporations in the United States and over 60% of the Fortune 500, that is the richest companies, U.S. companies, are incorporated in Delaware. This means that they are subject to Delaware law, and therefore all their the company law that applies is Delaware. When you go to the US and you study wherever, you may go to Texas, or you must go to Alabama, you go to Illinois, or you go to Washington State. When you study company law, corporation law, well, you're substantially studying the Delaware law, because the most companies are there. Why? Because it has a long tradition. It has a very simplified way of becoming incorporated. It has a very efficient court system that works, and the judges that sit on the Delaware Chancery, which is the special court that decides cases in the field of corporation law, are very experienced, among the most experienced judges in the US. So just to point out that they have pretty low tax regime, and so there's lots of reasons for which companies are incorporated in Delaware. This doesn't mean that they're headquarters. They simply go there, they're incorporated there, and then they have their operating headquarters anywhere else around the US. This is company law. So when we look at company law in the US, we are looking at, there are 50 different company laws, but we are looking mostly, it's not federal, therefore it is state, but we're looking mostly at Delaware corporation law. This is the first element. So company law is there. Let's look at financial markets. Where are the financial markets? Well, the financial markets are actually in New York. And what do we have here? We have two big, very big stock exchanges, which are the sort of the center of financial trading in the US. The New York Stock Exchange, as you can see, was founded way back in 1792, and it is the biggest stock market in the world. And then we have this NASDAQ. We always hear about NASDAQ when we listen to the news, and they tell us that the stock market in the US has gone down. They tell us New York and NASDAQ Stock Exchange and NASDAQ have gone down or have gone up. When it was created in 1971, this was the first moment in which we started introducing in financial services, in financial markets, we started introducing electronic trading. Before that time, and for at least 20 years onwards, originally traders were on the floor of the stock exchange, and with various signals, they were just asking for just showing their hand. There was a whole very complex and interesting way of sending messages, just showing how you showed your hands and what you wanted to buy and how much you wanted to buy or sell. But from the introduction of computerized systems, well, gradually, NASDAQ started in 71 and now has become the very global electronic market. While the New York Stock Exchange is only in New York, NASDAQ has branches all around the world because it has, since the beginning, it has been connected digitally through telecommunication networks, has been connected with its branches, and it is mostly for high-tech companies. High-tech companies mostly are there. Now, let's just look, I'm going to show you this this procedure, just so you can then understand how American companies work, and to understand then how our European model works. How does a company go public? So let's imagine a company is created, is founded, and needs capital, obviously. Well, the shareholders, the founders of the company can put some capital, but that surely isn't enough. Just think of, typically, in the US, we have some very bright, smart geniuses. It's called Bill Gates, it's Sergey Brin, Larry Page, who are even Mark Zuckerberg, who obviously are young, they're in their 20s, they want to set up a company, they have their ideas, but obviously they don't have the money. So they want to, the only way to collect the capital is to go public. So what do they do? A company that wants to go public and offer shares, therefore offers shares to sell the shares and to bring in the capital it needs to develop its activity, approaches an investment bank, and these banks specialized in investment, to act as an underwriter. What is the underwriter? It is a financial institution that somehow is there to sell all the shares on the market. So it nominally underwrites. Literally, you can translate that. In Italian or in other languages, whether it's French or German. The idea that you underwrite, therefore you become nominally the holder of the whole of the 100% of the shares, and they do an initial public offering, IPO. clearly in this field, but in all fields, there's a whole lot of acronyms. So IPO means initial public offering. Now, what happens afterwards? Once the underwriter, could be this financial bank, when it's very big, this bank then somehow has sub-underwriters. And this also happens also when you want to increase your capital. You are a small company and you want to increase, you see things are going very well and you want to increase your capital. You always do a public offer of new shares. But let's imagine we are doing a new company which is starting from scratch. Now, what happens now? The investment bank handles the initial issuing of shares in the market. It receives a fee, obviously, because it has a lot to do, and therefore, and this fee might even be retaining shares. Says, I don't want money, I want to keep shares because I see it's useful. Guaranteeing the company a determined minimum price per share. So obviously, this is the investment bank tries to understand what is the market for these shares, if it is a good moment. I mean, if you wanted to now, if you wanted to set up an automobile industry, well, you would find very few people willing to put their money in automobiles. But if you say, listen, I have a small pharmaceutical company, but we've been working for the last 10 years on these viruses, and we have very good ideas on how to combat viruses, and we can come up with good patents, well, probably people would like to put the money there rather than elsewhere. So the investment bank understands what is the market, how much request there is for that kind of shares, and says, well, I will sell these shares at $1, $10, $100 per share. And obviously the investment bank, which is there to make money, has the interest of selling all the shares. Otherwise, if it doesn't sell all the shares, those shares remain on the bank itself, and so, well, maybe it's not a very good idea. So what they're trying to do is sell all they can and make as much money as they can. The shares, first of all, are purchased by large institutional investors. So the investment bank goes to pension funds or mutual fund companies. Pension funds, which have in the US most pensions, it's not apart from those who work in public administration who have their pension, but generally other workers have private pension funds, and these private pension funds receive from the workers a certain amount of employees or workers, professionals, they receive a certain amount and they invest it at the end of when the persons retire, they receive a pension. So the pension funds are very strong and they want to put their money where they think it's going to be profitable, and or mutual fund companies that somehow are always in the welfare system. So the IPO, the initial public offering market, is known as primary or initial market. And once a stock has been issued in the primary market, all trading in the stock thereafter occurs through the stock exchanges in what is known as a secondary market. So what happens? These pension funds or mutual fund companies have bought shares and then they trade them according to whether they feel that it's a good moment to sell them or instead it's a good moment to buy shares. So initially there's the investment bank that has this initial public offering, and then it all goes on the stock market. So the stock market is the place where shares are traded. Now, just to show you what the importance of stock markets, so we're looking at company law, and we want to look also at stock markets. Well, this is the top 10 largest companies by market capitalization. And if you look at them, well, look at them, they're all US except for two, which are Chinese, Microsoft Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, which is Google, Facebook, Berkshire, Warren Buffett, and then Tencent and Alibaba, and then we find Visa and Morgan Chase. And you see, well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the top 10 are technology: Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Alphabet, Facebook, and Tencent are technology. And then we look at others that are Amazon and Alibaba, that are consumer services. So they are selling products to a platform. And then we find a couple, 3 financial: Berkshire, Warren Buffett, Visa, and JP Morgan and Chase Manhattan. So just to point out, these are, and if you look at them, the capitalization, what does capitalization mean? Obviously, this is August 1, 2019. Now, the value of shares has dropped, but it says that the shares, all the shares that were in the market were $1 billion, which is, and if you look at Apple and Amazon, are more or less the same. So just to show you how important these two stock exchange, whether we're talking of New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ, how important they are in finding capital and bringing capital to the two American companies. Now, let's just, before moving to the European model, I just would like to you to keep in mind, these are notions, economic notions, but are very important, because otherwise we risk we do not understand what is the relationship between company law and financial markets regulation, and maybe we don't know exactly, we don't understand what are we discussing in these days on sort of the what kind of financial aid should, in this case, in our case, European Union give to the economy. Just to point out, these are notions, obviously, especially for our Italian students who are in this semester studying microeconomics, but also macroeconomics, anyhow, economic theories, just to keep in mind these two differences between real economy, obviously, quote unquote, and financial economy. Real economy has to do with production and distribution of goods and services. Whether we are talking of automobiles, of wine, of telecommunication services, medical services, legal counseling. Well, this is production and distribution of goods. So here, what we are interested in to establish the value of what you buy, well, we look at the relationship between supply and demand. We don't find there's not enough masks, face masks to to avoid contagion in the coronavirus. Therefore, the price is very high, or there's market is swamped and price is very, very low. So, I mean, it's demand and supply. So this is rather simple. Why is gold more valuable than sand? For the simple reason that sand, we find sand everywhere, at the seaside, in the Sahara Desert, while gold, well, it's much more difficult to find. So scarcity is what brings the price up. And so this is just very elementary notion. When we're looking at the financial economy, what we're talking about is something different. So when I buy a car, obviously, if I buy very simple, I buy a Fiat 500, well, I spend 10,000, 11,000 euros. Well, I say, well, I have some money and I will buy the car. What use shall I do with the car? Do I need it? Do I not need it? And so on. but I value what I'm buying, the object or the service I'm purchasing. In financial economy, what we're talking, use and distribution of resources in a context of uncertainty. While if I buy a car, I know very well what I'm buying. Maybe I'll use it a lot. Maybe I bought it on the 1st of January, thinking I would use it a lot to go out on the weekends, and then something uncertain happens, such as the lockdown of these weeks. But this is something I haven't sort of bought the car. I bought the car thinking how much I would use it, and what if I think that 10,000, 11,000 euros makes sense for that object I am buying. In financial economy, what is use and distribution of resources in a context of uncertainty? What is uncertainty? The forecast of future value of what is traded. Money obviously goes up and down according to inflation or deflation. The value of money goes up and down according to the exchange rates. I might have bought lots of dollars and I have to compare, maybe I want to exchange them with euros. And so the relationship between dollars and euros, that is an element of uncertainty. Stocks, I bought lots of shares of an automobile company. Nobody buys any more automobiles, while someone else maybe has bought lots of shares of pharmaceutical company, and so you can see that well, maybe someone has done a good deal and some have done a bad deal. But it's a situation of uncertainty. You're buying in the forecast that you will have a certain return. It isn't only you're buying stocks just to, because you like stocks. You're buying stocks because you think that these stocks will give you a dividend and that they will increase in their value, and therefore you can sell them and make a profit. Or obviously opportunities, what you could do. We haven't considered another very important market, financial market in the US, which is in Chicago, so-called futures market, where you buy future opportunities, mostly in the agri-food sector. You are buying wheat, which hasn't yet born wheat in Argentina in 2025, or you're buying oil in Saudi Arabia in 2023. So you're buying opportunities for the future. Maybe you've done a good bet, maybe you've done a bad bet, but it's always something which is uncertain. Now, what are we looking at in financial economy? We're looking at informational asymmetries. Informational asymmetries are when I know something that you don't know. So I know that cars won't be bought. You don't know that cars won't. Nobody's going to buy a car. And I'm selling you, I have information because I have information that the automobile industry will go down, 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 and therefore very few people will buy cars. And you don't know it. So I sell you the shares of Toyota, Volkswagen, or whatever it is. I sell them at a pretty high price. You don't know that there's going to be a slump. Therefore, you're paying at 100 something that in 1 month's time, in 2 months' time, will be worth 70. So this is typical informational asymmetries. I have certain information that you do not have. And therefore, obviously, it could be vice versa. I know that there's going to be some need for certain vaccines, for certain medical, for certain drugs, and therefore I buy on the stock market, I buy lots of shares from pharmaceutical companies. You say, okay, well, that's fair price, I'll sell them. And after 1 month, 2 months, these prices of of the stocks have risen a lot because everybody's putting money in pharmaceutical companies. Then obviously risks, and this is what we're living today, is a typical risk. And so nobody would have thought in the beginning of January that what was seemed to be a limited Chinese epidemic would have become a worldwide emergency. And then interest rates that can go up and down, and obviously inflation, how much you can buy with money. So these are the, in a financial economy, as you see, all these are elements of uncertainty. When I buy a car, yes, I might be blocked and not be able to use that car, but it's something that is not, it doesn't really, the price of the car I'm buying does not depend on these uncertainties, whether there are going to be some environmental weekends by which you cannot use a car because of increasing pollution. You buy the car because you perceive the value of the car, the fact that you will use it, and you feel that that is the price you want to spend for a car. In financial assets, well, it's completely an issue of uncertainty. So if we bring all this back to the law, what we are talking about, in a real economy, what we are interested in is property, that is, who's entitled, what is the entitled in, has the right to take decisions in a company, and the shareholders, what are the powers, so we're interested in property, entitlement, and we are interested, obviously, in contract, which is the way for which we somehow do the real economy works. Real economy works on these two basic private law institutions. In financial economy, we are much more interested in, well, regulated markets. That is that the public, the state regulates the financial market. It regulates it to make it smooth, to make it transparent, to make it that it doesn't have danger for the investors, but it is mostly a regulated market in which, well, there's a lot of negotiation. People buy and sell shares or other financial instruments, but it is a regulated market. And so it works not, there are contracts, there are contracts, surely there are also entitled issues of entitlement, but we are talking mostly of public regulation of these markets. While here in real economy, well, it's much more the area of traditional property law and of traditional contract law. Now, let's sorry, there's a duplication of these. This away. Now, let's move to the Rhine model. Now, why is it called the Rhine model? You know, it's difficult to find a map of the Rhine. I hope you can see it reasonably well. I'll make it as big as I can. This is the Rhine. It's born in Switzerland, and it doesn't become very important. It starts becoming important in Bâle here, and then it goes in France, and you see France, Mulhouse, and then Colmar, Strasbourg, and then it goes into Germany, and we find Karlsruhe, Mannheim, Mainz, Wiesbaden, Koblenz, Bonn, Cologne, Düsseldorf, Duisburg, and then it ends up in Rotterdam. Now, this river is historically the main way of communication between Europe and very important part of Europe and the rest of the world, because what happens, Rotterdam is, if not the biggest, one of the biggest ports in the world, and historically, well, goods have arrived in Rotterdam and have moved through the river towards the rest of Europe, and vice versa. Goods have been produced in Europe and then moved for export towards Rotterdam port, where they're being exported. So just to point out that we call it the Rhine model because of the amount of companies that with the Industrial Revolution, which in continental Europe starts at the beginning of the 19th century, are developed on this main artery of communication. Obviously, in the 19th century, just as today, but even centuries before, if you want to have an economic activity, you mustn't be on top of a mountain. You mustn't be deep into a forest. You must be on some way of communication. It can be a road, but at those times roads were very uncertain. They didn't work very well. And the means of transport, we had carriages. We didn't even have at the beginning of the 19th century, we didn't even yet have trains. And so the river and communication, the river as was the main way of communication. So just to point out that it's called the Rhine model because this is the model that developed mostly in this part of the world, but then was the continental European system. So we've seen until now the Anglo-American model, how companies, when they looking for capital, they go public, they ask investors, savers to put money in there to buy shares. Here instead, we're talking of a different model, which is the Rhine model. So it makes it we use it because we've always called it Rhine model, and it's easy for us to identify it and compare it with the Anglo-American model. Now, what is the Rhine model? Individuals deposit their savings in the bank. So let's imagine people have a little bit, they have some profit, they have a salary, they don't spend everything, they save a little bit, and they say they will need this money for in the future, or that someone who's a businessman and says, well, I'm a small shopkeeper, and they have a little bit of profit and they put it in the bank. This is what traditionally happens in continental Europe. So the bank is a savings bank and they receive a small interest. So they put the money and say, well, the bank says, well, I'll give you 2%, 3% interest. And people say, okay, I'll be happy with this. Then I have all the money there. And when I want, I take it out. I spend it if I need, suddenly I need some money because I want to refurbish my house, I want to buy a new car, whatever. Money is there. What do the banks do? They receive these small deposits. These small deposits become a big, big amount, and they sell, quote unquote, this money to enterprises. They lend it to enterprises which need capital at a higher interest. So they receive money. In comes the deposits by individuals or small businesses, and out it goes in much bigger sums to companies that need capital for investment, for development, and so on, at a higher interest. So the difference between the loan interest, which is received, the bank lends 100 and receives 10% a year on that 100 it has lent, and deposit interest, which is paid, let's imagine 3%, so 10 minus 3 makes 7, is the main profit of the bank. So the bank substantially is someone that intermediates and buys something at a low price. Low price is the low interest rate, and sells that same product, obviously in bulk, at a much higher price. And so that is the profit of the bank. So what happens if we start comparing the Anglo-American model with the Rhine model? In the Anglo-American model, companies are dependent on the stock market, because if the stock market doesn't want to buy those shares, the company does not receive that money, doesn't receive the capital it needs. In the Rhine model, companies are dependent on banks. So here there's something which is very interesting, and we see how complex this is, especially in these days when we talk about economic crisis. What are the consequences that the economic crisis has here in the US? Are the consequences the same? The fact that companies are not going well, do they have the same consequences from an economic point of view and obviously from a legal point of view, which we shall see very soon? So just to point out that, so these two economic models are quite different, but we are this is not a class of business school. We want to see these differences because this has significant implications in the way the legal system is organized. And as we are lawyers, we want to know how law organizes companies, businesses, and so on. So in continental Europe, in the Rhine model, companies are dependent on banks. And so banks, I use banks as a generic expression, could be financial institutions, but mostly those who grant credit. Banks control the companies when deciding to grant credit. So first, why? Because a bank, when a company goes to the bank and says, I would like 1 million euros, well, the bank says, well, why do you need 1 million euros? They enter in the merit of that request. They try to understand if this is appropriate or not. Someone says, well, I would like to 1 million euros for a certain project, and the bank says, well, I don't think that is a good idea, giving you 1 million. I don't see how you're going to make any money out of that 1 million. So they control not only the credit worthiness of the company, but also the merits of the business plan of the company. So this shows how important it is. And so they decide, the bank decides whether to grant credit or not, and therefore controls what are the investment initiatives, the development initiatives of a company, but especially they control them from a legal point of view when, in order to guarantee the loan they have made, they receive the shares of the company in pledge. When a bank lends money, when it lends money, it asks for a guarantee. Now, this can be a personal guarantee by the owners of the company. They say, well, I will give, you could put a mortgage on my villa, on the buildings of the company. But most commonly, what do companies do in order to guarantee the banks? What do they do in order to guarantee the credit they have given to a company? They say, well, that's fine, but leave us the shares in pledge. And this means that when it comes to voting in assembly and deciding who the managers are and what are the main strategies of the company, well, the bank is there, sitting there and says, well, no, I would like this or I would like that. So it is not an indirect control. This is a direct control of a bank who holds the shares and is entitled to vote in the General Assembly of the shareholder meetings, and to designate who are the members of the board, who are the managers of the company. So we see that when we start comparing, in the Rhine model, traditionally, not always, but traditionally, we find a minor role of stock markets. While in the US, you have to go to the stock market. If you don't go to the stock market, you won't find the capital. In the Rhine model, well, stock markets are not really the main issue, or rather they are on a different aspect, because the main concern is maintaining control over the company. The founders, those who have founded that company, want to maintain control. While in the US, well, once the company has gone public, well, I mean, let's take Microsoft. Bill Gates now he's out of the company. The company is substantially public. The managers, he has obviously some shares and making lots of money, but he's not really controlled. He doesn't decide he's not interested. His children are doing other businesses. He's not interested in handing over Microsoft to a generation 1, 2, 3, 5 generations of Gates. He's not interested in that. He's made lots of money. He's done his own foundation. Bill and I think was in the Gates Foundation, which does lots of charitable activities. He's not interested in handing over this company to his successors, to the rest of his issue. In Italy, instead, Italy, to make a case, Agnelli, Fiat, well, the whole idea is transferring control of the company, of the Fiat Chrysler company, to the Agnelli family. And we find all these companies controlled by a family. Louis Vuitton, Moët Hennessy, which is controlled by Arnault, Volkswagen, which is controlled by Pirch family, Peugeot by the Peugeot family, Auchan, Roche, which is a Swiss pharmaceutical company, L'Oréal, Heineken, Dutch, Michelin, France. So we see throughout Europe, whether we're talking of Switzerland, Italy, France, or Germany, and we find also in Spain, we find families that have been owning a company for generations. And the main problem is how to hold control of that company within that family. So, and we have dynastic fights between the various sons and nephews and grandchildren to control. This is something that it does not exist in the US. It is in the US. The issue is that of how the market works and if the company is profitable or not. So what happens with this strange relationship, with this very solid relationship between banking institutions, financial institutions, and companies? Who controls access to credit controls the company. And so we find these what are called interlocking directories, which representatives of banks are on the board of companies and vice versa. We find in certain countries, typically France, but also in Germany and Italy, that you find people who are on the board of a bank, of a mechanical industry, of an agri-food industry, and you find them all the same people, all there, and they somehow coordinate their activity. So they're interlocked. The idea, interlocking gives you the idea of interests that are locked one with another, so you cannot move one piece of a company, because you must take into account that if you start moving that company, well, it will have effects on some other company. So there's much less dynamic. This obviously has significant consequences on the economy, but also on the law. Because when we start looking at the legal system of how company law is organized in the Rhine model, we see that I try to compare the two models. In the Anglo-American model versus the Rhine model. In the US, company law is aimed at ensuring full and correct information of the financial market. Why? Because obviously, if the market does not have full and correct information, it will not invest. So that is the first issue. You want that investors, and investors are not, as the Americans say, suckers. They're not stupid. They are careful, they want to know, they see, they sense that there's someone who is misleading them. And so, secondly, maximum competitivity among companies and their managers. So the problem is, the company is not who owns the company. If they are the sons, the relatives, grandchildren of a certain family, they are not interested. They want to know how much that company, from a financial point of view, is profitable. The shares, are they profitable or not? If they're not profitable, well, people will sell the shares, and what happens? There is a hostile takeover. What is a hostile takeover? When someone says the company is badly managed, I feel I can manage it much better, and I can make it profitable, I'm going to buy what I need on the stock market to control that company, and this is my objective. So it's a hostile takeover, and so suddenly we see that there are these companies that sort of change completely the managers, because the previous managers had not given what a reasonable profit to shareholders. And these shareholders are not me and you, they're very big financial institutions which say, hey, someone we've given the money to these, we bought the shares and therefore we've given money to this company, and they're doing bad use of this company. We are not receiving dividends. We are receiving a very low dividend. Why should we receive only a 2% dividend while a competing company is giving us 5%? So just to show you that it becomes very competitive, and managers are there saying, well, no, you're not a good manager, you're not providing good enough profits, and so you get rid of it. So this hostile takeover, and this is a very complex legal procedure, how you take over control of a company. Then obviously the main issue is tradability of shares. Shares must be traded. If they're not tradable, well, we're not interested in that kind of shares. We see in Europe, when you study company law, well, if you study all different kinds of shares, the issue is not so much that of trading shares. It's not, because stock market is not the real place. While in the US model, well, you need really trades. Shares must be tradable because the value is there. You can be able to buy and sell overnight according to what happens on the market. And at the same time, you want to protect shareholders, but not because you feel that shareholders are sort of, the small people, shareholders of big companies, but because you want trust by investors. If you do not protect shareholders, if the managers can get away with giving very low dividend, or doing improper use of their power, reaping away, getting very high salaries, fringe benefits, and bonuses, and not giving anything to the shareholders, well, the shareholders, get cross, and they say, well, we do not want these managers. We don't think this is a good manager. So you have to have, what is essential is a trust of investors. And the whole system, whether the company, corporation law, and financial markets, is meant to ensure trust of investors. Does it work? Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but this is the goal of the Anglo-American model. In the Rhine model, well, company law is aimed at ensuring control of the company with the lowest packet of shares. Now, obviously, you control a company if you have 50% plus one share. So that is obvious, because you go to the shareholder meeting and you put on the table your 50 plus 1% and say, well, listen, you have 49.499%, but I'm the majority, so I decide who runs the company. But this means that you are not able to put the shares on the stock market and to bring in some capital, or to use those shares as pledge and so on. So you're not, so it doesn't, you want to have as much free shares, company wants to have tradable shares, but the family group must retain control. And so you have a whole lot of schemes, mostly set up by the law, which allows, that is the law of the state, which allows someone to control a company with a rather limited amount of shares, 25–30%. One of the reasons, not the only one, of the transfer of the Fiat company, which for over a century had been based in Turin and transferred to Amsterdam, is the fact that you, according to Dutch law, you can control the company, and the family, the Agnelli family, or the descendants of the Agnelli family, Exor, control the FCA, Fiat Chrysler automobiles, with, well, around 30% of the shares. So the 70% is sold on the stock market, but they have very little importance. They do not somehow, they're not able to change. There's no possibility of having a hostile takeover or of change in the management. They are not able to change the management of the company. So, and this happens if you look at most family companies in Europe, you see that they have something between 25 and 35%, and this allows them, according to the law, whether it's Swiss law, Dutch law, German law, or French law, this allows them to control the company. So the main problem is how you ensure control of company. In the US, it's the opposite. It's not controlling, it's ensuring the competitivity, the fact that the companies are in the market. You want to buy this company, okay. You put a fair price and you buy this company. You buy the shares, and this encourages those who hold the control of the company and the managers to have a very good performance, because therefore the shares raise and becomes very expensive. You want to buy Microsoft, well, wow, it costs enormous amount of money. But if Microsoft is managed badly and the shares of Microsoft fall down, someone can come in and say, hey, I'm going to buy Microsoft. So the whole idea is, while in the US the problem is contendability, that therefore there can be a contest, a competition to buy, control a company. In Europe, instead, it's the opposite. We want to ensure that you can control certain groups, mostly family groups, but not only, also financial groups, control that and do not lose that control over the company. While in the US we find a whole lot of hostile takeovers or takeovers, mergers and acquisitions, in Europe it's much more difficult. For legal reasons, for economic reasons, we find this much difficult. Obviously, we're not talking whether it's better the American system or the European system. What we are interested in as lawyers is seeing that the legal system, the American company and financial markets legislation is made to favor the tradability, the possibility to buy companies. In continental Europe, well, much less. So it's less the market for companies and for shares is much less competitive. There are reasons, we can find very good reasons for one and the other. The problem is that we Europeans like this model and Americans like that model, and none of us want to exchange it, and nobody wants really in Europe the American model, and no American wants the European model. Just to point out that it is the differences between these two models. Now, then what else do we have in the Rhine model? That we have the legal system allows shareholder agreements that coordinate voting rights in meetings. That is that I hold 5%, someone else holds 7%, someone else holds 8%. And so if we put together and we are 30, we can put up 32, none of us really by ourselves, we can control the company, but if we do an agreement outside among us, we can control the company. So we meet before the shareholder meeting and say, listen, we are going to vote at the shareholder meeting, we're going to vote in a certain way, and we're going to decide that the managers are this, and these are the strategies of the company. So we have these shareholder agreements, which are very, because then this means that someone who holds 5% in one company and 8% in another company, and then 3% in another, it all becomes interlocking directories. It's somehow that the system is very, very less dynamic, and the control, one company controls other or influences the decisions of another company. And what we try to do in Europe instead is limit and control of financial institutions over companies. For example, establishing that banks cannot be shareholders of industrial companies. They have to limit their kind of control. So, but this is the law that somehow tries to soften up what are direct effects of the Rhine model, of the idea that the financial institutions control banks, because this obviously comes out vice versa. What you do, you say, hey, but if the bank controls me, well, I want to control the bank. And so it's somehow a dog which is chasing its tail. So the law tries to somehow manages completely to separate control over financial institutions and control over business, real economy businesses. So this is more or less a very rough comparison of the company law and financial markets regulation, Anglo-American model versus continental European model. Now, just wanted to open, just let me close here and just see if there are, okay, now I see some, okay, well, yes, well, that's quite often. It's, I apologize, sometimes I just, you think you've sent the attachment, I'll see why, who else? Well, it's all as well, the last group. Well, I'll as soon as the lesson finishes, I will send it to you. I apologize, as you're a lot. So I have to send various batches because the email system of the university, you can't send more than 15 at a time, otherwise it goes in spam, and so it does not receive it. So I'll be sending them to you as soon as the lesson finishes. Now, could you please repeat the reason behind the name of the Rhine model? Because the companies, the Industrial Revolution in continental Europe, which happened later than in England. England already started in the second half of the 18th century. In continental Europe, it starts at the beginning of the 19th century. Lots of these companies which were involved in the Industrial Revolution were along the Rhine. Why were they along the Rhine? They were along the Rhine because the Rhine is a waterway, because there are, in that region, there are coal mines, typically Saar and Luxembourg and Belgium, and coal was the main fuel of the industries, and there was lots of water. So water is not only the waterway, the rivers are not only the waterway, but also essential for certain kind of industries, typically steel industries. At the beginning of the 19th century, when you start developing railroads, you start developing big factories. So you need buildings, new kinds of buildings, not any longer stone houses or villas or mansions, but you need very big and high, start needing big buildings or industrial buildings. You need steel. To make steel, you need, on the one hand, you need fuel done by coal. You need raw materials, which is you transform iron and you use it to create steel, and you need lots and lots and lots of water. So in that area, you had the main raw materials to develop industries, heavy industries, and this brings us to why these companies are mostly in the in that area. Not only in that area, but you need raw materials, you need fuel, which at that time was coal. There was no petrol, there was no oil, and you needed, obviously, you needed water to in the production. If you just think of a steel industry, the amount of water it needs to cool off the system to avoid it exploding, and then obviously then you have the ways of communication, and these huge, you need barges to bring raw materials on one hand, and to move about these very heavy steel artifacts, beams, rails, and so on. So this is why the industrialization of that area was much before other parts of Europe because of all these various factors. Now, I hope this has clarified Shahadabi's question. Now, Zinai, I didn't understand to what model the last slide was related. Could you please explain again? Let's go back. It's the obviously what I was pointing out is the last slide was again showing the differences between the Anglo-American model and Rhine Model. Just let me go back on these because just these last two slides, obviously I'll be sending them to you. And what are the objectives? Because obviously the law is not, I always make this, this sort of anecdote. I mean, when Moses came down from Mount Sinai, he had 10 commandments. And among these 10 commandments, there was nothing on company law. It didn't say, well, listen, company law must be organized like that. So you decide how you want to organize company law in accordance to what your interests are, what your economic interests, your social interests are. So in the US company law is aimed at ensuring full and correct information of financial markets, because obviously the investor must know exactly the value of a share is the value of the information you have about that company and the value of the forecast you have. And the objective is that of favoring competitivity, typically American, strong competition with ups and downs. Obviously, Americans are very free market inside, a very free market when it comes to export. They're very protectionist when it comes to imports. Buy American. Trump says in a rather rude and vulgar way what many countries do in a softer way, but it has a protectionist attitude. Now, Trump, maybe we do not like him. We find he's not a kind of sort of politician we like, but he's saying in a rather boisterous way what others are doing. They don't say it, but they do it and put it in practice. But the American model is that of, generally speaking, of increasing maximum competition inside and making possibility to control over companies. How do you control a company? If you have enough shares and you can go to the shareholder meeting and say, listen, I have these amounts of shares and I control the company, and you must trust me. I have a plan. I'm going to give you back a dividend. You've had a lousy dividend, a very small dividend. Listen, shareholders, you must trust me. Listen, we have a track record. We have always, in the companies we have controlled, we have always given a 7%, 8% dividend per year. You in these last years have received 2%. I want to show you how this company can be profitable. I have a business plan that will make this company profitable. So they want competition. It's the American model, which is pretty rough, pretty, well, lots of heads are cut off, chopped off in this competition, mostly of managers. But, well, that's the American way of life and the American idea of the economic system. In Europe, instead, well, the whole idea is instead that we have these long traditions. They've been there for a century and a half. We want to ensure the continuity. We don't think that that the company should change the ownership all the time and that the stock market is a place where you buy a company. Volkswagen today belongs to this group and tomorrow it belongs to another group. No, we want continuity. It's not the problem of saying it's good or bad. This is the model that is followed in all continental European systems. We are trying to ensure control by a small group which is traditionally in charge of that company, that has been controlling that company for 10, 20, 30, 50, 80, 100, 150 years. We want to ensure control, continuity. We like it like that. This is not a general statement. If we look at the list, and I've tried to make a list of, most automobile companies, whether we look at, examples, BMW too is another example. We look at automobile companies. We look at other important enterprises in Europe. They are mostly family controlled. Just to point out, this is not something that we find only in continental Europe. If you go to Japan, and Japan is a very strong economic system, what we find is that Toyota, so in Japanese, Toyota, what happens is that there's always a family behind, and it's very interesting for those of us who have studied Roman history. What happens if there's a very smart manager in Toyota who's come outside? What happens? The owners of Toyota, the Toyota family, say, hey, listen, he's really smart. He's devoted. He's working only for us. We're going to adopt him. So he's adopted from a family law point of view. This person is adopted and he wasn't a member of the Toyota family. He is brought inside the family, and as if he was a member he becomes a member of the family. So this is a way through which one family continues to control the company. So just to point out that the idea of continuity in control is not something that we find only in continental Europe. We find it also in other countries, also, for example, in South Korea. Just to point out that when we start comparing, well, it's interesting to find certain models which are social models. That we find them also in other countries which are different from ours, and other countries which seem very similar. The US, well, they're significantly different. So I hope let's see if there are other questions. So Zinai, is that all right for you, Zinai? I hope that is okay. Are there other questions? For this part on the comparison between Rhine Model and, okay. Now I'll start something which is very much related to company law, which is generally, one doesn't really consider it. I feel it is something very important. So if you don't if you look at company law is somehow the physiology of how a business is managed and how it works and how it is born, how it should live. And what I would like to do now is look at something that is not to do with the physiology, but pathology. Obviously, I mean, if we just imagine we're talking of anatomy, obviously we are interested in anatomy. Once we've seen the physiology of the human body and we've seen how the heart, the blood, all the nerves and all the other parts, they work in the articulations and so on, physiology of the human body, well, we have to understand what are the illnesses of the human body and how it is regulated. So when we look at the law, and we look at the law of companies, well, we have to try to understand, obviously, also the issues of insolvency. When you study, and our Italian students are studying private law, and they, well, you look at property, but then obviously property, well, then you look at succession. Someone dies, and who does this property go to? So, I mean, we have to try to understand what happens also in the pathological aspects of companies. Companies are legal entities. They exist only to the extent that the law allows them to exist. And so we trying to understand what is the pathology of company law. Now, let's go back to the origins. We've already seen this when we started talking about the legal system. We started looking at the Compagnia, the Tuscan Compagnia, and how it worked, and the fact that, you know, it was rather difficult to avoid liability. So historically, debtor, someone who was in debt, was unlimitedly liable for his debts. Therefore, person had to pay his debt with all his estate. You could not somehow segregate part of your estate. You were liable with all your assets. Obviously, you tried to find a way not to have too many assets. But if you went insolvent, well, creditors could seize, could get hold, be satisfied on the whole patrimony, on the whole estate of the debtor. And this was very strong and harsh law because until the 19th century, imprisonment of individual debtors was very common. Although prison, I mean, if some of our English students, but I hope also some of our other students, if you read Oliver Twist, just to make an example, I mean, Dickens presents this situation of the 19th century imprisonment for bankruptcy very, very well. So if you just, oh, by the way, if someone is, sorry, I just want to give a suggestion, reading suggestion for those who are interested in the Rhine Model. Sorry, just let me see. I would strongly suggest those who are interested in novels and want to see the literary aspect, I would strongly suggest to read this, which is a saga. Come on. Okay. By this great German novelist, Willenbroek. And this is the family of history, the saga of this industrial company in the port town of Lübeck, northern Germany, and explains how the whole system works and then collapses. It is obviously, that is the name of family, the founders, and then suddenly it doesn't sing how it collapses. Just to point out that, I mean, we find in literature, if you want to look at the rise and fall of an industrial company, of an important industrial company in Germany, and that is, you could apply this to Italy, France, Spain, or other European countries, where we can look at Thomas Mann, and instead, sorry, just let me go back to, no, not this, sorry. If you want to see how the conditions of debtors were in the 19th century, you just read a few of Dickens' novels. I think Oliver Twist is the one that represents situation. Also, I think it's also Bleak Houses. There's few other novels, several novels by Dickens are, and you find them also in Balzac, Maison du Crégame, and we find a whole lot of the idea of insolvency, how it's very well depicted by novelists, both of the 19th century and Thomas Mann of the 20th century. So, and still now, when it comes to bankruptcy, that is insolvency, a significant insolvency, we find criminal sanctions when bankruptcy is somehow willful bankruptcy, but public prosecutors have pretty wide idea of what is a willful bankruptcy and tend to use criminal sanctions. Quite often they see behind the fact that a company is a failing company, often they see a crime. So as debtors were very severely punished for their insolvency, well, limited liability companies are one of the responses to avoid the harshness of insolvency law. With the East India Company, obviously nobody would have put 1 penny in the East India Company if they had been told, listen, but if the East India Company goes bankrupt, we're going to go and get the monies from you. But I put only a penny, I put only a guinea inside, a sterling, pound in the East India Company. Oh, sorry very much, you are unlimitedly liable. The limited liability company is born expressly to avoid harshness, which goes from unlimited liability, that means all your estate can be seized if the debtor does not pay, if the company does not pay, or at a certain point for what concerns managers, obviously they can be sent to jail for not having managed properly, having paid their debts. So this is, we know that already in the 17th century, we see the development of limited liability companies somehow to avoid the principle of unlimited liability of debtors. What was the main scope of this principle, which goes back to Roman law, so it's nothing, something strange. We find this also way back, even before Roman law, the idea that debtor had to answer with all his assets, all his estate for his debts. The law was mostly concerned about creditors. Creditors have to be protected. So it is what Latin's nice expression, because we love Latin, and it's not only in Italy, as a matter of fact, in England and in the US, they really love Latin even more than us. Sorry. Favor creditoris. This is main principle that we find historically. The whole insolvency law is to favor, to protect creditors. Harsh law, well, what can we do about this? But debtors, well, they've miscalculated, they have not acted properly, well, they have to pay, and they will pay until the last penny, last cent they must pay. Now, let's go back to our slides. So, what happens? Over the last 50 years, things start changing. This is very important. And they change throughout the Western world. They don't change exactly in the same way because it also depends on the kind of economic system and the legal system and the constitutional system that is behind the economy. So just keep in mind, when we started looking at those issues on the Constitution, the role of Constitution, well, it's not only very high level principles that are there, you know, just to concern, well, democracy, sovereignty, and balance of powers, and so on. No, it has to do with very practical aspects and what are the constitutional interests that should be protected by the law at large. So, first element, what comes out? We start distinguishing. It's not simply insolvency law, which at 50 years ago was mostly bankruptcy. Bankruptcy was 90%, and then it was 10% of, you know, small procedures. Mostly was bankruptcy. You didn't pay, well, you went bankrupt, and that was the end of you. And then there was whole liquidation of the company, and the spoils, what was left of the company, was divided among the creditors. In the last 50 years, well, we start distinguishing creditors. Creditors are not all the same. You have suppliers, those who supply, let's imagine, raw materials to the company. Buyers, those who have paid the price but have not received what they should have received. I've ordered an automobile from a company that has gone bust, and I have not received the automobile. How do I get protected? Credit institutions, those who have put money, who have financed the company. Employees, in a system where employees are mostly have no long-term life time labor relationship, which is not fixed. Its time limit is not finished until the people retire. They are employees of the company. They are creditors. They are creditors for the fact that they should be paid, their salary should be paid, but also for the fact that they should have other benefits. And so employees are an important part of creditors. Tax authorities. Authorities say, hey, listen, you should have paid taxes. You haven't paid taxes. And welfare institutions, think in Europe, where a considerable amount of monies from companies go to the welfare system and social security system, national health system. So just to point out how the creditors are not the same. So we have to distinguish what are the roles of the creditors. And we must also distinguish among debtors. It's not the same. Who is insolvent? Is it a standalone company? It's a company that is there and has, well, the shareholders behind it, but it doesn't have relations with other companies. Or is it a company that belongs to a holding? It is a company in a group of companies. Is it a small and medium-sized enterprise, SME, which is very important in Europe, in Italy in particular, small and medium-sized enterprise? Are they consumers who are unable to pay? They've bought a car, they've bought a house, and they're unable to pay. Can they, what is their situation? Just to point out that well, we start distinguishing among debtors. And what is most important, especially in Europe, continental Europe, but also in England, what are the social effects of insolvency? Now, this is something that generally is, in the US is not very much considered, or it is less considered. In Europe, it is a main social and political concern. What are the systemic effects in a territory? So there's a company which produces certain amount of products in a certain region, in a certain province. What is the effect if that company becomes insolvent? Loss of jobs, disruption of upstream and downstream enterprises. Just think of those who provide, transport services. Company is a factory and needs transport services. Obviously, if the company closes, transport services are lost, and all other kinds of jobs are lost in that area, in that town, in that province. Public finance consequences. Obviously, what happens generally if in Europe, if employees are dismissed and because the company has gone into liquidation, well, the unemployment benefits, which are paid by the general taxpayer. So the company goes in liquidation, the taxpayers have to pay for unemployment benefits, and this can be very, very expensive if there's a widespread unemployment. So just to point out that the whole system is very much, when we look at insolvency, we can't look only at the relationship, which is perfectly correct, between debtor and creditor, but we have to look also at a whole lot of social consequences and of constitutional interest, typically of welfare interests, which are protected by the Constitution. So what happens is that we have a growing prevalence of the general interest of society over the individual interest of creditors. So yes, if we look at it from a private law perspective, well, creditors must be protected. There is favor creditoris, but let's first look at what are the social consequences. And therefore, bankruptcy, that is the fact that the company is closed down, its assets liquidated and distributed among the creditors, that is the last resource. While generally what we've been doing these last 20, 30 years is creating, from a legal point of view, and those of you who will study insolvency law will understand this very clearly, creation of procedures to cure, quote unquote, insolvency by continuing productivity of the enterprise. They say, listen, well, it's been badly managed, you've done some mistakes, the economic situation is bad, but you can recover, because once this situation has passed and the economy starts again, well, this industry will be necessary. Let's try to keep it going, because if we close it down, well, we're going to lose a whole lot of jobs, expertise, competences, skills, and people will emigrate and so on. Let's try and keep it going in as much as we can. So what is the attempt then to cure insolvency? Insolvency is an illness of a company, of a business, but while before it was a deadly illness. You died, you were insolvent, you were dead. You're dead. You're declared dead, and you're just brought to the graveyard, and that's the end of you. Yeah, instead we say, hey, but we can still save this patient. We can save it, this patient, this business, this ailing business, we can save it through a whole lot of procedures. Let's see if we can manage to save it. So just to point out that this is how you try to somehow bring the idea. And then what happens is that then we find, while once upon a time it was, well, the debtors went to jail because they were insolvent, and then, well, there was a court-appointed liquidated started selling everything and distributing what was the monies that were made from the liquidation to the rest of to the creditors. Here we find a whole lot of various institutions, bankruptcy courts, committees of creditors who say, well, we can find an agreement, we'll allow this company, we won't ask for bankruptcy, we'll let this company somehow recover, we control it. Political instances, typically Ministry of Labor and Welfare or local authorities. Just to point out that this bank solvency becomes, from a typically private law aspect of the relationship between debtors and creditors and protection of the creditors' interests, it becomes a political, social, institutional, and constitutional issue, protection of work, protection of people who have invested, maybe in the company, you want to try to save this company from insolvency. So just to point out that these are some aspects which have to be taken into consideration. I haven't finished yet with insolvency, but I'll finish tomorrow. I just wanted to, before closing the lesson, I just wanted to ask if there's someone who has, if you have, let's go on the chat, sorry. Are there any questions on this part of the insolvency? No questions? Just to know, I just sort of sometimes I'm concerned that maybe I sort of sort of gone too ahead and made it not sort of. I understand what I'm saying, but you do not. So it's should be important thing is that you understand what I've tried to convey. Okay, then if everything is clear, well, good rest of the afternoon and take care, obviously, and then tomorrow we'll continue with the relationship between economic system and legal system, and then I'll hand out some ideas which I would like to discuss with you on the so I would like to have next week as sort of a test for just to keep you in practice with your English and with a mock test on the possible exam. But we'll discuss this tomorrow.